panel. We're going to move on to a question that has been the most popular question. We've already touched on it a little bit, so it is to do with titles. The current SCoPEd document removes the titles used in previous versions and replaces them with columns A, B and C. So we thought it might be useful to read a little bit about what SCoPEd says about this. So they say on the document, current differentiation cannot be clearly defined by the titles that are being used by the three participating bodies. Titles have therefore been removed so that the focus at this stage is on the evidence rather than the titles, because it demonstrates that all are respected, qualified roles. Each organisation will work individually and collectively to agree titles prior to publication of the final version. So what are the panel's thoughts on this? And we're going to go to Rima first.
Okay, so I think, yeah, well, it threw me. The ABC thing really threw me. And like I said at the start, I think it made me think about the titles more. And personally, I don't know how we can feed back on this framework without understanding what titles are going to go with the categories, and to sort of say it'll be added later. I think that's quite a complex process in itself, and I know as members we would still have a say in these titles, because I think that's what's been suggested is there'll be a consultation process when we're talking about titles. I really think that we need to know them from the beginning. Personally, my personal view is that I just think having three titles does cause a hierarchy, even if it doesn't intend to, for whatever reason. I think it does create a hierarchy, and I would prefer to have one title for us that we can all agree on. And for those on Twitter, we did a bit of a poll to ask clients really what titles do they use in calling us. How do they refer to us? And the majority, when I last looked at the poll, was that they refer to us as therapist. So that doesn't even fit into the three titles that are being proposed at this stage. And I think titles are important, and we need to really debate this of what we want as a profession around this, because I think there is a lot of ownership around the psychotherapist title compared to a counsellor title, for example. And I think there is a lot of history around why there is two titles anyway in the first place. So my personal point of view is I think we should have one title that we should agree on, and I think we should have consultation with all stakeholders around that. And I think that would make it clearer. And I think from being an Indian therapist, and I don't want to speak for all BAME therapists, so I'm speaking for myself in this, but I do think titles are important, because that's how we are seen, is through our title. And I think there needs to be more thought on that. Like, for example, what would it feel like to be a Black male therapist in category A, and how would it impact them being called a counsellor compared to a white therapist in category C, if they're to be called psychotherapists? I think there are some implications around this, around titles. So for equality, and to sort of, I think there needs to be one title. Personally, that's my personal view, but I do see that there's a lot of attachment with the titles. But I think in order to have one title, we also then need to agree on a set training standards, and they all vary at the moment, so it's not an easy task, really, but that's my view.
Thank you. Okay, so next we're going to go to Emma.
Hi. Again, I think there's been a conflation of two issues. So if we talk about the framework that's being presented, we're back to the issue that titles don't infer competence. So deciding personally if it was based on this framework and the way it's presented in the 3 columns around the 5 themes, I would totally scrap any titles because they don't mean anything. Titles of counsellors or psychotherapists they're not protected titles. So whether you're in column A, B, or C and call yourself a chief bottle washer doesn't make any difference. There could be one organisation that would advertise for a staff counsellor, whereas another organisation could advertise for a psychotherapist, depending on what their HR decide to call it, and it could be an identical job description. So that's where I think it's conflated, that as long as we keep on arguing about which column is named what and which title it infers a person to work under, depending on which column they're under, it doesn't make any sense because titles do not infer competency. I see this as a competency framework that even if you removed all 3 columns and just said you could present evidence on how you meet each of these competencies and get assessed by your supervisor every 6 months or annually, similar to the way doctors get appraised and revalidated, there isn't any difference. The same way a junior registrar gets revalidated is exactly the same process that a consultant gets revalidated. They're put under the same level of scrutiny because there's no difference in their titles. It's about competency to do your job. And in private practice, it wouldn't make any difference anyway. So that's my view.
Thank you very much, Emma. Okay, let's go to Andy now.
It's really hard not to be a bit cynical about this for me. The removal of the titles and then for them to be planned to be reinstated in some form, because we can't just forget that they were there. So, and I think Rima might have said earlier that it almost made her think about them more, and I can see why they would want us to not really think about it too much, like the title element, because the title issue, as sort of Emma was saying, does sort of it highlights a flaw in the whole project, really, of trying to sort of separate us into columns and based on competence and training and so on. I think it's really important to remember, I mean, this is one of my kind of pet stories, so people have heard it before, forgive me, but the reason we use counselling counsellor as titles is because Carl Rogers in the 1950s used that switch to counsellor because in the counselling centre he was working in and ran, in the state at the time, you had to be a medical doctor, medically qualified to practice psychotherapy. So in a way, it was quite a sort of mischievous, almost kind of political kind of thing to carry on doing their work, which they perceived, and his book titles tell you that Carl Rogers saw it as psychotherapy. But so the history tells us that these words aren't, they're not just descriptors of actual differences. That there's a kind of political history to them, which has evolved over time and appeals to people in different ways. And there's another thing which I wrote about in a previous SCoPEd piece, which is that person-centered therapy was very nearly found its sort of professional home within UKCP, the psychotherapy organisation. But it was just small issues, which meant that leading practitioners at the time, when UKCP and BACP, or BAC as it was then, was developing, meant that those leading person-centered practitioners kind of decided to sort of throw their lot in with BACP. So what may look quite clear now of that there's psychotherapists and counsellors was historically not clear at all. It was deeply charged with a kind of political reasoning and motivations and agendas, and I mean that sort of that is kind of sustained and well understood in the person-centered approach, where you see no differentiation between those two terms. They're used interchangeably. Many person-centered therapists train on counselling and psychotherapy trainings, some of which don't, it would seem, meet the column C psychotherapist competencies. So, yeah, it's a complicated history, but I think it's quite important to really get your head around what the sort of other meanings of these terms, if that makes sense. But what that tells us is that SCoPEd isn't mapping what's there, it's imposing something. It's sort of overlaying a certain kind of appearance onto something. And then you can start to ask, well, why is it doing that? And, you know, what's the motivation for that, which is perhaps a different question. But it's not mapping what's there, it's trying to organize things in a particular way. I mean, I think it was Dennis Postal who said that about SCoPEd, that it was like someone looking at a kind of landscape filled with trees and meadows and clearings and dark forests and hills and mountains, and sort of thinking, well, that's a bit chaotic. You know, I think we should organise this more. You know, we need to kind of celebrate the diversity in our approach, in our field, in the work, and celebrate the kind of richness of that, and find a way of articulating that. We don't have to throw our lot in with healthcare, you know, and medical practice to try and articulate the value of what we do. If we do that, we lose something. Well, arguably, going back to the heart metaphor, we lose the heart of what we're doing. And I think the profession's dangerously far down that road, and SCoPEd's a sort of big example of that. So, yeah, I mean, the title issue is, at one level, it's like, oh, here we are again, you know, having this conversation about titles and the power struggle between them. But it's also a really crucial one, and it's really it's a real window into what's actually happening.
Thanks a lot, Andy. It's always fascinating to hear some history. I knew that your former point, I didn't know your latter point, so I've learned something. Yeah, and I guess with history, you know, yeah, there may be an argument for moving on and, you know, moving away from things that have happened in the past or whatever, but also I think history is very important in terms of learning and really being able to look at everything in the context of history. So I hope viewers found that useful. Let's go to Erin next.
I guess my first feeling response to them taking the titles out temporarily was that I found it quite comical. So I thought it was quite funny, really, to kind of, oh, we're going to take them out so you can't see them, and then we're going to put them back in. I just found it amusing. And then I guess a lot of therapists have talked about finding it quite insulting, and I can really understand how people are feeling that way about it. I guess my major concern, reflecting on it, is that I'm concerned about people missing that the titles are going to be put back in. I didn't see this initially. It was pointed out to me by somebody that the titles are going back in. And my concern is that maybe not everybody will see that the titles are going back in. And so when the consultations with members are being done, perhaps people will be, I mean, I actually did see people post, now isn't it good they've taken the titles out, where, you know, with no kind of appreciation, like not having seen the fact that they're going to go back in. So my concern is that people are going to be filling out the consultation without realising that the titles are going to be going back in. Unknown titles are going to be going back in at a later stage, and we still don't know the process for how those titles are going to be decided. So that's my major concern.
Okay, thanks a lot, Erin. And yeah, I mean, again, that's a really useful kind of learning point, hopefully, for people to hear that that's what the deal is with the titles. Let's move finally on to Jay.
Hi there. I'm sort of waiting for the screen to get bigger, which it isn't. Anyway, I think yeah. I mean, my view is basically, I think psychotherapists are going to be loath to change their title, yeah, and loath to think that anyone else can claim it. And like I said before, I think if you're a UKCP member, that's absolutely fair. You know, If you want to think that psychotherapy is better and or different, go for it. But I don't think the BACP, because they're meant to represent both counsellors and psychotherapists, should tolerate that view. Back in 2009, the BACP actually had a policy that they didn't recognise a difference between counselling and psychotherapy, and I'm very confused as to when they changed that or where they changed that. But certainly, back last time of statutory regulation, they had a view that counselling and psychotherapy were the same. In my view, that title would have to go in terms of the SCoPE project for there to be any chance of any consensus. But I don't think you can predict that would happen. My own views, I'm not so bothered by title as long as different levels, everyone can claim the badges, as it were. So say, for instance, you, through pre-qualification and post-qualification experience, for instance, became very familiar with, say, hearing voices. Now, and working with people who hear voices. Now, I think it doesn't really matter whether you're a counsellor or a psychotherapist, but you both should be able to claim the badge. And that's my view. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks a lot, Ray. Well, I mean, some really, really interesting answers there. I don't know, does anyone have anything to say, or have we kind of covered everything?
I guess the one point that I didn't make was that I did a BACP accredited counselling and psychotherapy diploma, which was 100 client hours. It was a postgraduate diploma, but I think BACP are going to really have to think about whether they are going to be accrediting trainings with the psychotherapy title attached to them if they're saying that there is this difference.
Yeah, and I think hopefully we're going to think a bit more about that actually in the next question. Is that right, Peter?
Yeah, that's right. Just before we move on to that, I just wanted to highlight that we're on about nearly 3:25, and we have got about 5 more questions to go through. So, we'll just wanted to highlight that to everybody. It might be that we run a little bit over the 4 o'clock.